been reading a few things outside of Buddhism of late. Other people who've been talking about Buddhism, obviously read about the Four Noble Truths, and have sort of said, well, what is wrong with desire anyway? It's ridiculous, there's something wrong with Buddhism, and we can end up dismissing Buddhism, which would be a mistake in my humble opinion, obviously. And also it would render 2,500 years of religious practices sort of brushed away. And obviously, if we're prepared to do that, then we probably need to stop, pause, and think maybe I'm not quite understanding the message here. So let's go and have a look at this and see if we can get to the bottom of what the Buddha meant and how he connected it with dissatisfactoriness, which is what we're translating as the term dukkha, that Sanskrit term. So let's go back to the Pali Canon. So we're going to have a look at an extract from the first sermon given by the Buddha, and this is the one where he delivers to the five ascetics the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So this is what he says about the second noble truth, which is the noble truth on the origin of dukkha, origin of suffering or dissatisfactoriness. He says, "This, O monks, is the truth of the arising of suffering. It is this thirst or craving which gives rise to rebirth, which is bound up with passionate delight, and which seeks fresh pleasure now here and now there, in the form of thirst for sensual pleasure, thirst for existence, and thirst for non-existence." So, in fact, the Buddha's not even using the term desire. He's using the term thirst. Now, the Vedic Sanskrit term for this is trusna. I will apologize up front for my Sanskrit pronunciation. It's not that great. It has to be said, but it's TRSNA with various diacriticals on it. Trusna or Trusna, and in fact, it does share the same etymological basis as the English word thirst. Trusna and thirst come from the same Indo-European word root, which is interesting already. So it suggests, at least to me, that the English term thirst has a much closer bearing on what the Buddha was in fact talking about. So when we have this idea of thirst, we have something now that is much stronger than, say, a want or a wish, i.e., what those words convey. It's something that's very emotionally charged. Alan Bennett, the playwright, once said, "It's like asking a man in a desert whether he prefers Perrier or Buxton water." That thirst is so powerful. It drives us, and so that drivenness is something perhaps that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at what the Buddha is actually talking about. So the other thing I just want to come on to now is because the other thing we likened it to was instinct, isn't it? We have this notion of instinct, that we have these natural instincts. So when we are thirsty, we want water. When we're hungry, we want food, shelter, security, procreation, all the rest of it. And these are the sort of instinctual terms that we have. Now, it's interesting that in early animal behavior studies, there is this notion called instinct crossing. And instinct crossing is like the switch that switches an instinct off. So instincts can be switched on and they can be switched off. And this you can see, if you look at those natural history films, some of those David Attenborough films, you see the sort of herds of zebra on the sort of African savannah, and they are grazing, and they migrate, to new grazing grounds, and they are sort of followed by a sort of ragtag um, army of predators, lions and leopards and cheetahs and hyenas and so on, wild dogs, and they are all just waiting for an opportunity to, bring down a zebra and have lunch. But the thing is that most of the time, when you see lions and so forth and big cats like that, they're actually spending most of the time sitting in the shade, not doing anything. And the reason that they're not doing anything, even though the zebra herd's, maybe, 100 yards away, the reason they're not doing anything is that they're not hungry. And if they're not hungry, then the instinct to hunt doesn't arise. It's switched off. It's only when the feeling of hunger begins to arise, there's a drop in blood sugar or something like that, that the hunting instinct gets switched on, and that's when the big cat will then, get up from underneath its tree in its shade and will go out and try and do something about it. And the interesting thing is that, they then go through this sort of whole chase, and let's say they're successful. I mean, 9 times out of 10 they're not, but let's say it's the one time when they are actually successful and they bring down their prey and they have lunch, and they don't sort of say, well, that was tasty, I'm going to have another one, and immediately go off and have another one, because having eaten, that switches off the instinct to go hunting. So for most animals, unless they're under some kind of duress or stress, their instinct actually is not a thirst. Their instinct is a sort of management system. It's a guidance system for living as a big cat. They do what they do when they need to, and their instincts sort of guide them, and by guiding their behavior. So there's a sort of balance to it. They don't just sort of go berserk. Now, contrast this, for example, with somebody who compulsively eats or who compulsively doesn't eat. These are, you can always trace an instinct back, maybe to do with hunger, or maybe in the second case to do with self-view or status. Self-view has to do with status, which is also linked to various drives. So that also, although the instinctual drives still are there at the root of our desires and even our thirsts, they do not necessarily get switched on and switched off appropriately to the situation. There is a lack of instinct crossing, and this is something that makes instinct, therefore, different to what I want. Although there's a relationship, what I want has as its roots some kind of instinctual satisfaction. That's what it's working towards. It's not operating in the clean way as we've just seen with the lion. So here, actually, in this particular extract, the Buddha outlines or defines 3 types of thirst. The craving for passionate delight, which seeks fresh pleasure, now here, now there, in the form of thirst for sensual pleasure. That's pleasure of the senses. That is quite simply, we have a pleasant experience, and we want to repeat it, and then we want to repeat it, and we want to repeat it, and again and again and again. And there's a sort of compulsiveness that is beginning to accrue around it. This is what the Buddha is talking about, and this is when it becomes thirst. Notice that he says he's not actually saying that there's something wrong with, enjoying a good meal, or having great sex. It's the thirst for it. That's what links it to the dissatisfactoriness. And then the other 2 forms